Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for being here. First and foremost, the last video has done really well in the last couple of weeks. We've been reaching a lot of new viewers and the channel has hit 45,000 subscribers. So honestly, I just wanted to give a big thank you to everyone. If you really do learn something from this work, if you find these photographs to be enjoyable, or you can deduce different things about the narrative that you may not have been able to really decipher before, hopefully my work has been able to do that for you, and if it has, please continue to share this work when you can. Now, my next video, something I've been focusing on for a while in my research but haven't really fully discussed yet, is going to be ancient Egypt. And this ties in directly with the Canaanite or Phoenician religions. The real ancient religions are the ones that I want to look at in upcoming videos. But first I wanted to focus on a part of the narrative that's really been interesting to me, and that is the removal or the replacing or the renovation of all of these ancient Egyptian structures. Now, we have history in Egypt that stretches really for thousands and thousands of years, and this is all in the quote BC times, or in times really where the history is hard to be represented accurately because we have so many different sources that say different things. So what we have today, according to the current narrative, is really an amalgamation, an agreement of different things by scholars that they could deduce from all of these different ancient narratives. Really, we have a lot here that I want to dive into, but the main focus is going to be Abu Simbel and the whole idea of removing the nose to spite one's face. Now, this is a saying that basically means don't make a problem worse than it already is. Don't do something drastic that will make your decision one that you cannot come back from. Don't focus on something that is negative and then compound that negative. Be happy with what you have, essentially. But in an ancient form of looking at this, one can really notice that this saying might have a lot more of a nefarious beginning, because we look at ancient statues from all around the world, the most beautiful of statues, and one thing that we notice is very often these noses are removed. Now, we can even tie this back to ancient Egypt and to one dynasty in particular. So that's what I want to look at today. Now, a good intro into this topic, I believe, is the Abu Simbel or Abu Simbel in ancient Egypt. This structure was said to have been built from 1264 BC through 1244 BC. So roughly 20 years is all it took for this immense structure to rise out of the ground. And what's moreover about this that's so impressive is the fact that we're told that this was built during the reign of Ramesses II. Now, if you're unfamiliar, Ramesses II, by many Egyptologists, is considered to be one of, if not the most successful pharaoh in the whole history of Egypt. But moreover, in recent years, we've had depictions of Ramses that have come out, especially when the discovery of his mummy occurred. And we actually have evidence that shows that Ramses may not have been exactly who the historians painted him out to be. Now, we'll begin by talking about Abu Simbel. This amazing structure is said to consist of essentially 4 humongous statues carved into this rock that all depict the same pharaoh, that is, Pharaoh Ramses II. However, in the photographs we're looking at now, which are in fact the oldest known photographs of Abu Simbel, you will come to find that these faces and the whole structure itself really has this sort of ominous feel about it. You can look at these statues and you can't necessarily see how these are all the same person. It almost appears as if they were modified at a later time. Now, how is that possible, or how can we look at the narrative and maybe paint a different picture? Well, we'll discuss where this was built. And this was built in the ancient area of Nubia, once home to the kingdom of Kush. Now, this kingdom of Kush flourished in the gold trade in ancient times, and they were the main supplier of gold for Egypt. When we dive into this further, the Nubians for many years were free people until they were, quote, conquered by Egypt shortly before the period that Ramses II took over. In looking to unify Egypt and to unite the lands of Egypt, we're told that Ramses went on a campaign. Basically, his whole time as pharaoh was spent replacing and renovating different major structures all throughout Egypt and its newly acquired lands, and basically painting himself to be the one who was the great uniter, the great unifier, the one who put all of these things together. Now, why is that important, you might ask? Well, if you're unfamiliar with the history, something that we've noticed throughout time is often we have these, quote, indigenous structures, these indigenous cities, these cities that seem to predate the Europeans arriving to that area and basically calculating the history that they wanted to apply. But before that, we have throughout America, throughout Europe, throughout most of the world, evidence of indigenous peoples who created these different sort of land masses themselves, whether it be mounds or tells or different things like that. These structures that both incorporated the natural landscape and also incorporated massive feats of ancient engineering. Now, eventually, other groups would come and build on top of these previous structures. They would build upwards. And that's how we have a lot of these cities with the castles at the apex of the city on a hillside. And it's surrounded by these massive walls and things of that nature. But many times, when you look into the history of these places, even in the current narrative, it's accepted that they were once built by indigenous people. Now, when you come back to Egypt and you look at Abu Simbel, which was built in Nubia, you come to find that one of the main things about Ramses and his reign in Egypt was going into these lands that were acquired by Egypt and basically to renovate all of the major structures and to make these major structures all about him, all about Ramses, all about his reign, to say he was the great uniter of all of these people. And one of the things that he did that is depicted in his hieroglyphs, and I found this to be so interesting, he basically wrote that his hieroglyphs had to be cut much deeper than the hieroglyphs of his predecessors and of the people that he eventually ended up ruling over. Because when he would go to their ancient monuments and the such, he found that many of their hieroglyphs were starting to disappear just through the weathering of time. And he also noted that this made it easy for him to essentially go in and chisel away at the ancient hieroglyphs to replace them with hieroglyphs written by himself and written to promote his own rule. So essentially, again, when you look at this history, Ramses is made out to be this great unifier who had so many building projects, really innumerable building projects all throughout Egypt. They say he was responsible or had a part in, or he ordered the construction of all of these different things all around Egypt. But when you dive into the true narrative just a little bit deeper, you come to find that essentially all he was doing was renovating previous structures, digging out previous structures, basically finding previous structures that were already built, and then he was applying his name and his hieroglyphs to it. And essentially, he admits in his own hieroglyphs to erasing the previous history to reconstruct it in his own image. So if that's not a telltale sign of what we're looking at here in Abu Simbel, I don't know what is. Diving into another key aspect that has only really come to light in recent years is that for many really decades, I'd say over a century, from the time of Egyptology until really the 1990s, we have this idea that the Egyptian pharaohs had this sort of very unique look about them. They were tall, they were slender, they had this auburn sort of skin, and they possibly had blue or green eyes and dark hair, very much like Ramses and his predecessors were depicted in the hieroglyphs and things like that, and in the monuments and the statues, all of those things. But then we have the discovery of Ramses II. We have the discovery of his mummy. And upon unveiling this mummy to the world, you come to find that Ramses had bright red hair, and he had these sort of hazel to blue colored eyes. And besides that, he had this very small and slender frame. Many times, ancient Egyptian pharaohs are depicted almost hulking over the rest of the people. They are very tall, they are very distinguished. But then you look at Ramses, and he was said to stand about 5'7", and he weighed no more than 140 pounds. And he has all of these features that are very Indo-Aryan. And when that is compared to all of the monuments of him, especially the ones that are found in Nubia, you can argue that we can clearly see that in some of these monuments, they may have been depicting other people, and then they were changed to say that they depicted Ramses, but really, they could have depicted those who ruled these areas at a much earlier time. And that also could give us an association with who actually constructed these structures originally. So when we look at Abu Simbel sitting in Nubia, sitting in the ancient kingdom of Kush, And then we're told that Ramses, throughout his rule as pharaoh, would go in and he would basically change these monuments and change these structures and make them all about himself. We can argue that Abu Simbel was possibly a very important ancient Nubian structure, and Ramses basically probably could have, and I don't want to say for sure, but he could have changed this history and basically made it all about himself, just like all the other projects that he had in Egypt that he has admitted to doing that to in his own hieroglyphs. So that's something worth researching for sure. Why I bring that up and why I say that is because I believe something we should look more into is to the reign and the rule of the Potomac dynasty in Egypt. This could have been sort of the revealer of what was going on back then. And I think the ancient sources will paint the best picture. Those sources from early Egyptology, from the mid to late 1800s, really could have more information in them that wasn't allowed to come to the forefront of thought in 2022, meaning that the current narrative could possibly leave out some of these aspects that could have been discussed in earlier works. So that's why I've been trying to dive in to these Egyptology works about the religion of ancient Egypt and to this information about the rulers to try and depict if there's anything there that really stands out to me. And one person that did in particular is this character of Ramses II. And I say character because we don't exactly know who he was. We have many different alterations that were done to his character throughout the years of him ruling Egypt. And throughout his different monuments and things like that found in Egypt, we have different depictions of him given and different hieroglyphs telling his story. And the stories are often not the same. They often have conflicting details. So it's almost up to us and up to the ancient research that we can get our hands on to try and deduce what exactly happened during the Potomac reign of ancient Egypt. Now, diving into this Abu Simbel structure even further, and this is probably the most interesting point of this whole video, possibly, at least this is the one that drew me to wanting to make this video. We have the idea that this massive monument to, quote, Ramses, that was built in ancient Nubia, that was carved into the mountainside, into the rock side, into the cliffside, carved by hand, chiseled by hand. We have that in the current narrative. And this was done at least in 1264 BC and possibly earlier if it was a site that was actually renovated by Ramses. Now, knowing all that and seeing these photographs, all of the earliest photographs that I presented in this video, the ones at the beginning of the video, really up until this point, they've been photographs of Abu Simbel during its renovation period. But as we dive into more modern history, we're actually told something quite amazing, quite peculiar happened. This site was eventually planned by the Egyptian government to be flooded, and the whole site was going to be covered over. That is when, apparently, we have Egyptian historians and those who wanted to protect these monuments step up. And they come up with the idea of going into this monument that's built into a rock face, built into the side of this huge rock, huge mountainside. They have the idea to go in with basically saws and cut the whole entire monument into pieces, and then to move the monument a mere couple of 100 meters away up on the hillside so that it doesn't get flooded. Now, if that sounds impossible, I thought the same thing, but we actually have photographs of this occurring. And this all occurred in the 1960s. We have these amazing photographs. Basically, what we're told is the Egyptian government went in, they cut all of this monument, the whole of Abu Simbel, into pieces, and they basically took these pieces and then they rearranged these pieces on top of the hill that Abu Simbel used to sit below. Now, does that make any sense to you? Is that possible? Is there a reason to do this other than something that is nefarious?